We're going to be talking about inclusivity and diversity in tabletop games because someone watching me stream a computer game brought to my attention this thing called Roll Inclusive, which is this kickstarted book project about all these topics. And I think it's important, before I launch into the ranting and raving and the unnecessarily circumlocution and verbose insults that I'm going to throw at this thing, that you understand where I'm coming from, because the tendency of people is to ignore any reason you might be upset with something that is legitimate, and instead, because you're upset with something that calls itself inclusive and whatever else, it must be because you're a galloping racist or sexist or homophobe or whatever. So I'm going to explicitly explain why I am upset and pissed off with this before I launch into it. And therefore, if you choose to ignore me, you're just being a dick. Here's the problem, right? I know the role-playing community inside and out. I've been a part of it as a business, I've been a part of it as a fan, I've been involved with it internationally, I've gone to conventions, I've written innumerable books and so on this, articles, blogs, whatever else. I know the role-playing industry, I know the role-playing community, and you will be hard-pressed to find a more inclusive, opening, welcoming place than the role-playing community. It is about as perfect as I think you can get for a fandom or a hobby or whatever, being open and welcoming to people to come into it. Unfortunately, this means that certain people take advantage of that willingness to bend over backwards to accommodate them and just come in and shit the place up, like Aleister Crowley at a carpet warehouse. It's just, that's what's insulting. This is a community that has done anything and everything it can to be welcoming, often to its own detriment, and yet it's still never good enough. And now we have this 320-page book of essays telling you exactly how bad and wrong your fun is. It's insulting. It's as if I'd opened a pub, you know, and I had discounts during Pride Week, and I made sure that there were ramps and a disabled toilet and anything and everything else, and I'd gone out to all these communities and said, hey, you're welcome, come and have a drink here on our opening night. We want to be a place where everyone can feel included and welcome. And then on that opening day, someone comes to the bar and berates you for being racist because there's black pudding in your breakfast menu or something. It's petty, it's stupid, it's unnecessary, and it's tarring a community, or in this case a landlord, who has done everything they can to be welcoming and inclusive to you. And you just take a big old shit on them. That's why I'm upset. Not because I don't like darkies at the table, or I'm worried for my anal virginity, or anything like that. No, it's because stuff like this just shows you don't know or understand the community, and you're trying to take advantage and shame them in order to make them do things that you want, that half the time, more than half the time, are already there. Well, are we clear? I have explicitly told you why I'm upset. And it's not racism, it's not sexism, it's not homophobia, it's not transphobia, it's not anything like that. It's because you're a bunch of insulting cunts. Clear? Good.
Roll Inclusive is a popular science essay book that aims to introduce you to about 320 pages of diversity and representation in pen and paper role-playing. 16 renowned German-speaking and international authors address a variety of topics. What can a respectful presentation of discriminated groups of people look like in products and at the gaming table? How can culture-sensitive world construction succeed? And how important is historical correctness? How accessible is the pen and paper role-playing game, and how is accessibility at the gaming table and in communication ordered? A toolkit with practical tips for implementation and a collection of specially developed nano games complete the book and ensure a high added value for players and game controllers. The content of the book is edited by Aşkın-Hayat roleplay editor and diversity trainer Frank Rice, psychotherapist for children and adolescents and systemic supervisor, and Judith Vogt, roleplayer and novelist.
Now, you might think I'm hypocritical in some way for addressing these issues. After all, I did put out my own book, Diversity Dungeons, which wasn't actually a troll like some people have intimated it to be. It was meant to look at these issues and how to incorporate them into your games without ignoring them. So how does your game treat homosexuality? How might it differ in how people react to your character and so on? Are there gender differences in capacity, and what might that look like under popular systems? That was never intended to be something that you take on and use necessarily in your games, just an example of what such a thing might look like, and yet I was still criticised for including that. Constructivists seem to be ruling everywhere these days, it seems. Now, of course, by popular science, which generally isn't particularly good science anyway, they mean popular social science.
It's not an exact science.
It's not even science.
I think this reveals a couple of patent misunderstandings of what a role-playing game is, how a role-playing game works. When you construct a fantasy world, a fantasy setting, you're looking for things that make for interesting adventures, not for inclusivity and niceness. Yeah, when you set up a kingdom that is viciously xenophobic or has some kind of pogrom against a racial minority or a sexual minority or whatever else, you're not reflecting your views in the game world. You're creating a villain or an interesting context in which stories can take place. Smuggling slaves out from an enslavement kingdom, or hiding sexual minorities away from the authorities as an inquisition sweeps through the land, or whatever else it might be. You know, these challenges, these dangers, these acts of villainy are what make for interesting games. You're inclusive in that you're including historical or fantastical issues that have affected these communities, and if someone then chooses to play a character in one of these things, then they're buying into that storyline, and that is how they're being included, right? And the other thing, the really important thing that is being missed here, is that all role-playing games are DIY toolkits. You can do what you want with them. If your group's all white supremacists, you could run some kind of horrendous racist game if you wanted, and it wouldn't hurt anybody else because it's only happening at your table. If you want to run an incredibly woke game, it's boring as shit and I won't be joining you, but there's nothing stopping you doing that either. Nothing that is written down in any of these books is something that you have to do. You don't have to have that particular spin on that culture, or that world, or that society, or that criminal code, or whatever else. You can change anything you want, even the rules. So, if you start blaming a game that is a toolkit that you're free to fuck about with, you're missing a huge part of what role-playing games are and what makes them so amazing. And this is a weird thing to run into. This has always been understood by people since, white box D&D, that you can do what you like. Yeah, some things might be superficially the same from one table to the next, but plenty of other things change. Everyone's game is homebrew to one extent or another. It's just the nature of the beast. So you just don't seem to understand how this works, why choices are made, whether it be in terms of storytelling or in terms of what you as the player and the games master do with it.
Essay 1. Why we need a better representation of diversity in role-playing. At the beginning, the terms diversity and representation should be defined. It also explores the implications of having certain groups of people expressing negative stereotypes over and over again.
In the common understanding, diversity would mean a multiplicity, lots of different things. And in the context of creativity and so on, you could be forgiven for thinking that that kind of diversity, the diversity that matters, is diversity of thought and approach and aesthetic and opinion. That's not what they mean here. When they talk about diversity, they mean something very superficial. Are there enough brown faces in this game? Are there enough gay characters in this game? Things like that. Things that essentially really don't matter a great deal any more than the amount of meaning that we give them. Now, historically, and in certain fantastical kingdoms and so on, these things might have a lot more meaning. Certainly, when we look at historical games, and if you want to preserve historical verisimilitude, and if you want to honour the sacrifices and difficulties that people had in the past, then you need to preserve that bigotry and so on from the past. The diversity that matters is that diversity of opinion and approach and so on. And ironically, the people asking for surface diversity in terms of racial demographic, gender demographic and so on, all have pretty much identical views on the approach, the meaning, all of these things. So if you see someone calling for diversity, unfortunately it actually means what they're calling for is an homogeneous game world, Fantasy Seattle, circa 1990, whatever, as the pundit puts it. They're not actually interested in diversity. They're interested in every game being the same Captain Planet nonsense.
Let our powers combine. Earth, fire, wind, heart. Your powers combined. I am Captain Planet.
Peaceful, diverse worlds where everyone gets on just hunky-dory are boring. You need conflict to make these things interesting. A story without conflict is literature, and that's just not very interesting because it's also without story. That's a partially sarcastic definition of literary fiction, a book about nothing. It's just not interesting. It's the representation. Well, okay. The idea is good behind representation. You want to make everyone feel welcome and that there are examples they can point to say that I belong in this game. If it's a historical game, you're going to have issues again. If your game is set in medieval Bohemia or something, then having a date trader from southern Africa is not going to work particularly well within that setting. You're going to have to really bend and twist and shift around ideas to try and wedge that in. And if you do that in the book that you're presenting, it can really throw people off. And when you're playing, it can really throw people out of the world and prevent them from truly immersing in it, because it violates what many of them might know about the real world. That's an issue. That's more of an issue in computer games and so on, and I want to concentrate more on role-playing games. But there is another point to be made that's drawn from research on computer games. The role-playing market isn't really big enough for this kind of in-depth research, but research into computer games found that most people who play couldn't give two tugs of a dead dog's cock whether they're represented in the game. It is only a tiny minority of activists that care. Most people, when they're playing through computer games, don't identify with the avatar that they're controlling. That's just like a playing piece, like a pawn on a chessboard or whatever. It's something they act through in order to do things, and it's their experience as themselves of playing the game that is more important. There's no particular reason to think that that's much different in tabletop gaming, except that if you want to feel represented, you are playing a character that you create within the bounds of the rules. That is the ultimate form of inclusion, because it's your exact desires, your exact thing that you want to be created and placed into the game more than just about any other form of interactive play. Is there an argument when it comes to representation in the books? Well, again, that can throw people out, and unfortunately, a lot of the time what happens is that representation and inclusivity becomes a box ticking exercise. Well, we have to have one character that's black, we have to have one character that's a lesbian, we have to have one character that's crippled, or whatever else. And that's shallow, and it's not very good representation, and heaven forfend you should present any of these protected classes as a villain or something, because then you must be evil and bigoted towards them. So all you're doing really is binding the hands of the creators of these games so that they have to do this, that and the other, and so that they can't do this, that and the other without an extremely vocal and poorly informed amount of criticism being flung at them. So these are kind of false goals. Make a good game first. That's what matters. Role-playing has the ultimate in representation and should be a place where we can present diverse views without it being inferred that we agree with them.
Essay 2. Being as if. Appropriation and negation of identity in RPGs. Why do we enjoy playing, and what happens in our heads when we play different roles from our own?
Is there an idea that is more stupid, more counterproductive, more insulting to the intellect than the concept of cultural appropriation? It should more properly be termed cultural appreciation, but people have taken it to such an extreme that white people with dreadlocks get attacked, get them cut off, and so on, because it's assumed that this hairstyle, this element of culture, this meme, only belongs to a certain race. That strikes me as a bit racist. And then it's just counterfactual as well. We know from art and artifacts from ancient Greece that the Spartans wore their hair in dreadlocks, for example. We know from ice mummies that northern Europeans from the Ice Age wore their hair in dreadlocks and braids and something approximating cornrows and all the rest of it. This isn't stuff that belongs to any particular subset, and to say that it does is frankly racist. If we want empathy, if we want understanding, if we want to get on with each other, then this kind of cross-pollination, this appreciation of each other's culture and its elements is a good thing and something we should encourage. So does this happen in gaming? When you create a fantasy culture, you often don't have time or space or word count to go into tremendous detail, so there is a tendency to rely on certain stereotypes. And if you've got a South American kingdom, they're going to have ziggurats, probably, and they're probably going to indulge in human sacrifice, and they're probably going to wear feathers or whatever, and they're probably going to have a lot of gold. Why? Because this is a convenient hook to hang something on, and everyone is on the same page when you talk about that culture. There are games that have gone out of their way to avoid these stereotypes and the tropes that Tolkien created, elves, dwarves, all the rest of it. But they don't tend to do as well. They get remembered fondly, such as Mar Barker's work or similar, but they never really take off commercially and really make a huge success of themselves because they're less accessible. So if you want a game to be popular, you need to hang certain elements on stereotypes. And if you want it to be acclaimed critically, then maybe you put a bit more thought into it. You can always put more thought in under the surface level of the stereotypes. But when you say dwarf, everyone has a certain picture in their mind. When you say Aztec, everyone has a certain picture in their mind. Yeah, that's convenient and it's easy. In games, while they are art, they're not high art. Another thing you would think they would want to encourage would be playing something that you're not, or writing experiences and cultures and points of view that you're not, because this kind of thing encourages empathy and understanding. And it's one of the great and wonderful things that there is about role-playing games, I think. You can walk in someone else's shoes, and it needn't even be someone real. It needn't even be someone from a real culture or something. You can project your mind into a what-if scenario and interact with it as a character, delineated by their capabilities and knowledge in the same way as real people are. Yeah, empathy can be created by playing something else. Playing a woman if you're a man, playing someone gay or bisexual if you're straight, whatever it might be. This is something we should encourage, I think. Sure, people stumble on the way, but you got to have some kind of forgiveness and understanding that they're at least making an effort. This isn't a threat to anybody, and there's no reason to be upset by it, not really.
Essay 3. The game with well-worn role models. Pretty ugly? Roleplay and role models. How are characters portrayed, why are stereotypes used, and what is one when you break them up?
I think we've covered that, which means they've probably already covered that by this point, which means there's going to be a lot of needless repetition in this book.
The political dimension of role-playing. Is role-playing a political hobby? How politically should roleplay be?
This section's apparently written by Lena Falk, using a full last name. Someone I've actually met, someone who used to do translations into German for White Wolf, and never struck me as a particularly politically correct person in the way that they played or the way that they expressed themselves. And never seemed to demonstrate any thought that White Wolf stuff was beyond the pale. I don't know whether she's still involved with that, but hey, all I'm saying is I've got a bit of a perspective on that. The trouble is, this is a preloaded question because certain people think anything and everything is political. They think all art is political. They think the personal is political. They probably think going and taking a shit is political. Politics does intersect with just about everything. This is true, and we live in particularly politically polarized times. But to me, that is an argument not to be political. Perhaps I should make some clarifications here. It's a common criticism that a lot of us have of this kind of entryism into games and into nerd media as a whole, whether it be films, comic books, computer games, role-playing games, that is misunderstood, terribly misunderstood. When we say we don't like politics in our games, we're not saying that games shouldn't be political, they shouldn't have political intrigue, or they shouldn't have wars, or they should gloss over real-life events or whatever else. What is being objected to is political proselytization, is the reduction of games to propaganda, or comics, or whatever else. That's what's being objected to. You can have political ideas in mind when you make something. They can be implicit in the design. Certainly your politics will probably be influential on whatever you make, but the moment you start really directly preaching at people is the moment you start running into the Christian rock problem. Christian rock is shit, by and large, 99% of the time. So, Sturgeon squared. Why? Because they put the message, they're trying to convert you and bring you to Jesus over and above music, musicality, fun, and anything else. Yeah, their desire to win you for Jesus overrides everything else. And this was less so in the past because everyone was Christian. So if you were Christian, you were free to put the message second or whatever and concentrate on the music because everyone was just swimming in Christianity all the time, which is why you can look back at Bach or whoever else and see the religious music or the religious art that they created, and it's still good in and of itself. Whereas once you get to the modern age where we have much more diversity when it comes to religious concepts and ideas and so on, and it's not hegemonic Christianity, that's when you seem to start running into this problem because people are putting the propaganda first. It's why only the first Rage Against the Machine album to make it big was any good. Yeah, they'd been honing their craft on that, and while it was messaging, propagandizing, there was talent there because they'd been working on it for a while before they made their break. It's the same with games. If you make an overt political statement, you're necessarily narrowing your audience, you're reducing diversity, you're reducing representation. And it's why this kind of homogenous pap is just so shit for making stories, and it's why overtly political games tend to turn people off. And then it's even worse when that infects the non-game culture around a game. You can look at the fuss about White Wolf that has essentially stalled their return to the gaming space. You can look at how post-human studios, who unfortunately often get mistaken for me, have banned libertarians and men's rights activists from their forums. You know, this isn't an increase in diversity. This is a reduction in it. It doesn't matter whether you agree with those people or not. It doesn't matter whether I agree with them or not. It's really got fuck all to do with the game, or the games, or the gaming community, what any of these people believe, so long as everyone can sit down and play a game and be brought together by that. So, should games tackle politics? Sure. Should they be political in terms of being propaganda? I would say no. You know, but you're free to express yourself in whatever way you want, but the problem here is that they're saying that they should be, must be, have to be, and that whether you agree or not, whatever you produce is political. You don't know your own mind. That's when this becomes problematic. If you want to make political games, knock yourself out. If you want to make propaganda games, knock yourself out, but don't go telling me or anyone else what we can or can't do.
Essay 5. Critical hit, critical whiteness, racism, critical thinking and acting in roleplay. What is racism? Why do we still live in a racist system even in post-colonial times? And why does it help us to reflect that in our favourite hobby?
There's a lot to unpack there in such a short little sentence, and it seems confused, and I'm not sure whether that's down to bad translation or not. Should we reflect racism and so on in our games? Yes, because I think they've been such a dominant force in our reality. Do we still live in a racist system? I would say no, and I don't think that's necessarily got anything to do with colonial or post-colonialism. There are racists. Do we live in a racist society? No, our society has laid out in law and otherwise that all people are to be treated equally on the basis of race. And it doesn't really bode well when you appear to be saying that you're anti-racist, but then whiteness is in your title. There is no such fucking thing as whiteness, just as there is no such fucking thing as blackness. It's memes, not genes. Yeah, you can see that in the Carltons of this world on the one hand, and the wannabe Stains Massive on the other. But should we reflect racial issues in our games? Certainly, if the time period calls for it, or the location calls for it. There's a stereotype that hardly ever gets called out, the racist hillbilly. You know, that's almost bound to turn up if your game wanders towards the deep south of America, and perhaps that's a little unfair, but it's one of those stereotypes that's easy to hang something on, and that goes back a very long way. So yeah, we can deal with this, we can examine this. It's especially important in historical games, and what we gain from that is perspective and empathy. And usually the argument is that we shouldn't include any of these things, that we should whitewash history and ignore the struggles that people have had. So I don't know whether this is down to bad translation or what. It does seem to be a bit of a confused message.
People of colour, between othering and adequate representation, including presentation and sensitive representation of people of colour in RPG products and at the gaming table.
Well, we've already covered that, which means they've already covered that in all likelihood, which means this essay is likely redundant, and representation takes care of itself. Your table is your table, play it how you want. But equality would mean not treating any particular racial group with kid gloves or differently to any other. If your fantasy world can have stereotypical raping and pillaging Vikings at one end of the scale, then it can have your stereotypical spear-chucking lion worshippers at the other, and to do otherwise would be hypocritical.
Essay 7. Love and greetings from the gingerbread person. Gender diversity in roleplay. Sexual and sexual diversity in role-playing worlds, and how a relaxed representation in role-playing is possible.
it's a peculiarity of tabletop role-playing game that violence can be found everywhere and nobody seems to give a toss about that. While sex and sexuality is always controversial in its implementation and inclusion in any way, shape or form, I think that's a great pity. I think sex and sexuality are massive drivers in human and presumably demi-human affairs and so on, in every meaning of the word affair. But the point is that this hardly ever comes up at all. And again, this devolves often to a box ticking exercise, and I know many people don't like the term, but virtue signalling. You notice this more in computer games, where a character is basically walking around with a billboard screaming, "I'm trans, I'm trans, I'm trans," to anyone who will listen, which is pointless and doesn't do anything to serve anyone of a marginalised sexuality or gender expression whatsoever. And when we're talking about historical games, obviously there's big issues around this sort of thing, that you can point to individual historical figures that bucked the trend there. But again, it's all boils down to, this is your table, play how you want, and stop trying to tell other people how to play.
Essay 8. Mentally Ill Hero. Mental illness is not a rare topic in role-playing games. How can I sensitively approach the understanding of mental illness?
Your game might include psychopaths, it might include people who are depressive, your characters might take on mental aberrations as a result of horrors or whatever else that they happen to have seen or succumbed to. This really depends on the kind of the game. But as someone who is fucking mental, I don't expect any of you to have completely absorbed the DSM and for every representation of everyone with a mental health issue in your game, whether NPC or player character, to be perfect. Do what works for your game, and if anyone complains, tell them Grim said you could.
People with disabilities in roleplay. How are people with disabilities represented and portrayed in role-playing settings, products, and at the gaming table? What could a more appropriate representation look like?
What the fuck are you expecting? Wheelchair accessible dungeons? A lot of this is going to depend on the setting. Yeah, if it's an historical piratical setting, you might well have people with one eye or a peg leg or a peg dick or whatever else. It's gonna depend. There is no single straight answer here, and I think a lot of these questions are missing something really important about games. They're not real.
It's a puppet!
Essay 10. The Open Table. Accessibility in a Communicative Hobby. How to deal with visual and hearing disabilities or speech problems at the gaming table. How can you make RPG material more accessible?
Finally, a worthwhile topic, and one probably worth talking about in a whole other video. I've considered this to an extent. I thought about recording some of my books as audio books, but there's a problem that lies in the way of this. I mean, there are tools and things people use to get around. I've seen blind people at conventions have like flip cards on a keyring with braille numbers, 1 to 6, 1 to 10, 1 to whatever, as a stand-in for dice. There are apps that can randomize or read something out for you, that sort of thing. So, you know, there are some options out there, but the problem is primarily one that's fiscal, in that role-playing games are such a relatively small industry operating on such small margins that there isn't really the capacity to consider these extreme minority markets. There's just not the money there to put the effort into making an audiobook or whatever else for most people. I still might give it a try, but I don't think it's going to be anything particularly groundbreaking or interesting. I don't think it's going to help me very much, and it does feel very much like empty virtue signaling. I just want to do it to show that I can and to see whether it is viable in an experiment. I don't know that it is, but this is a worthwhile conversation to have. But ultimately, anything that we do on this score has to be as close to free as possible, or a charitable effort, by someone. I know there are people who do books on tape charitably, specifically for blind people. Maybe they could be persuaded a little to expand their scope to include books as games. Maybe that's something we could do, seek charitable assistance. But yeah, worth another video on this at some point, I think.
Essay 11, Intersectionality at the Table. What is intersectionality, and how do multiple limitations and marginalisation pose greater challenges than the sum of their parts?
Intersectionality is a meta game of one-downmanship. You might call it bottom trumps, I guess, where people compete to say who is the most oppressed and marginalised person and therefore gets the right to speak, because if you're not the most marginalised and oppressed person, then you don't get to speak and you're not allowed to have any opinions on anything. Intersectionality is what destroyed Occupy and has prevented the left from being effective ever since. It's poison, don't touch it.
It's evil! Don't touch it!
Essay 12, At Eye Level. By hierarchy, community standards, and what feminism has to do with it. What is the power structure between the game management and the players, and how can we make the cooperation safer?
I'll tell you one thing that doesn't make cooperation at the table easier, and that's when you're trying to describe a dungeon room and someone keeps interrupting with some obscure reference to Stalin's collectivization of the kulaks or something. It's not really conducive to a good gaming atmosphere at all. And safe? What the absolute fuck are you talking about? Other than treading on a D4, there's really not anything that's unsafe about sitting at a table with your friends and playing make-believe. That's about as safe as anything gets while still being an activity. Look, there's a reason insufferable proselytizers are so annoying, and it's why paladins are so annoying in games.
Essay 13, Culture-sensitive world building. Stereotypes are not just for characters, they can also affect whole fictional worlds, countries and cultures. How can I approach foreigners without being overbearing?
I think we've covered that, which means they have, which means, again, that's more repetition of the same sort of themes.
Essay 14, That Was Just Like That. The problem of historical correctness, authenticity and fantasy. Many role-playing settings are based on real historical epochs. How we are caught between the sense of historical correctness and alienation into the fantastic.
I've covered this too, but it bears a little bit of repetition and a little bit of expansion. There is a paradox when it comes to fantastical elements in games, and that is that the fantastical is much easier to swallow and to absorb if everything else is pretty much as we expect. You can take Game of Thrones as one example. The dragons and the White Walkers and the magic and all the rest is more acceptable because we recognise our common humanity and the common history, the period upon which it was based, in terms of all the infighting between the different houses and within the different houses, and the struggles for power and the desire to be king and all the rest of it. All of that is familiar, something we understand, something we recognise, and that helps keep us grounded so that we can accept the fantastical elements that are layered on top. Another extreme would be probably the defining novel of the new weird, Perdido Street Station by China Mayville. Here is a fantastical world where nothing makes sense whatsoever. There's weird technology, there's magic, there's strange and bizarre races and so on. But the interactions between all of these elements are recognisable, understandable. There's an oppressive government with secret powers at work. There's punishments of criminals, albeit a weird punishment. There's a relationship at the centre of the whole story that is frowned upon by the rest of society, seen as a bit weird. There's something there we can empathise with and understand, and then the fantastical layer just lends it a kind of dreamlike quality. So there's something to be said for keeping a lot of elements being familiar, something we understand, something we can see at play in the world. And when it comes to history, we shouldn't whitewash over these things in the past, these terrible, horrible things that were done. If we ignore them when we play in that period of history, we do a disservice to people. And there's no reason to say that a character can't be an exception or have to struggle against these things and yet receive some kind of compensation in the game at a meta level for that. But to ignore it and to pretend it didn't happen or whatever, well, he who forgets history is doomed to repeat it.
Essay 15. Illustration. Visual communication in the field of tension between stereotypes and diversity. Illustrator Ben Mayer takes us behind the scenes of RPG products.
We've already covered that. Doubtless it's going to include some decrying of sexist illustration or whatever. But this just falls back to it becoming a box-ticking exercise. United Colours of Faerun is just not interesting. Essay 16. Avery Alder, Queering Game Design, Talk Transcription. The game designer and author Avery Alder, Monster Hearts, A Quiet Year, Dream Askew, gives exciting insights behind the scenes of role-playing development and shows how, for example, queer themes can also be experienced at the gaming table via special game mechanics. Do I need to go over again how this is the opposite of equality, how special treatment over and above anyone else is counterproductive and fuels prejudice? I mean, surely we know and understand this by now, and the last thing we need is queered gaming mechanics from the same people that brought you queer agriculture and feminist glaciology. Here's a queer way to roll some dice. Then they're going to end up with some nano games, some small games to illustrate some of these concepts through play, which sounds about as much fun as a rectal exam from Dr. Cactua. But so why does this annoy and upset me so much? Like I said at the beginning, it's not that I have any objection to people of unconventional sexuality, minority, race, or whatever. What I object to is this pointless deconstruction and reconstruction and criticism and parasitization upon a hobby off the back of insulting people who have always been open and inclusive and have bent over backwards to be open and inclusive. It's just insulting. And the idea that we need 320 pages, that's more than most game books in size, telling us exactly how to play our games, is profoundly insulting. Especially this approach, which isn't about incorporating or including these things in the game, but about demanding that we change what we write and how we play and so on to conform to a very narrow, very constrictive, very prescriptive set of values. No, gaming is diverse, gaming is open, it has always been diverse and open, and the reason for that is not 320 page screeds on how you're doing it wrong. It's because it's a toolkit, because it's open, because you can make your own character, because you can make your own game, because you can carve away the things that you don't like and bolt on things that you do like. This idea that there is a right way to play and everything else is wrong, that there is a right way to construct a world or to treat the particular race or whatever else, it's all nonsense. That entire 320 pages could be replaced entirely with a post-it note saying, "The game is your own, do what thou wilt." That's all it needs. And there's underlying assumptions beneath all of this that I could go on for another hour about. Right? The idea that games are racist because they include orcs and orcs are irredeemably evil says nothing about the real world. They should be more properly called a species, perhaps. And in many of these fantasy worlds, magic is real, gods are real, good and evil are objective, not subjective concepts. And these races are created by evil gods in order to do evil, and they are irredeemably evil. You need to Expand your horizons. If I, a devout atheist, can understand and appreciate alternative metaphysics within a fantasy setting, surely you can. This is just so unnecessary. And that's why I get wound up. Zang.
I can get you anything you want. You just have to talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. I'm your priest. I'm your shrink. I'm your main connection to the switchboard of souls. I'm the magic man. The Santa Claus of the subconscious. You say it. You even think it. You can have it.